Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chase Cotton, your host today, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Ed Felten, our distinguished lecture speaker today. Until this morning, I'd never met Ed, but we have a number of common friends, and in researching him, I realized that we have a lot of common technical interests, and many of the things that I talk to my students about, Ed's been involved with. I'm a cybersecurity person. Both Ed and our own Dave Farber, who hangs out in Japan these days, both have served in the federal government as chief technical officers. Dave at the FCC and Ed at the Federal Trade Commission, who I learned this morning basically is where the policy thoughts about privacy hang out in the federal government. And he was also deputy CTO at the White House. It's kind of interesting. I could think of very few things that a technical person can do that's more important than being at the table in government when decisions are being made at the intersection between technology and people. So that's very cool. And another kind of near intersection with Ed, Ed's the Bob Kahn Professor of Computer Science and Public Affairs at Princeton University. And probably don't know this, but Farber's often described as the grandfather of the internet. And Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf are really the true fathers of the internet, having brought us TCP and IP. And so I was lucky enough to work with Bob Kahn on the Gigabit Networking Initiative when he formed CNRI. And so I can think of no higher honor than being the Bob Kahn named professor, because indeed we kind of owe our entire lives to where the internet has gone. So some of you know we consider Caltech to be a landmark school for technical education, but I don't know if most people understand that the real important part about Caltech has to do with having been an undergraduate there, okay? Being a graduate student at Caltech's no big deal. I've had one work for me, and lovely man, and did wonderful stuff, but he explained this to me very carefully. Ed graduated from Caltech in physics, and while after graduation, he stayed on hacking early supercomputers and then moved to the University of Washington and completed his MS and PhD, and actually his advisor and a collaborator of mine they both share the same advisor, a guy named Tom Anderson. In 1993, he joined the computer science faculty at Princeton, and his interest started expanding into policy in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and he joined an organization there called the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, and now he also has a center there called the Director for the Center of Information and Technology Policy. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and the American Academy of Arts and Science, and he's a fellow of the ACM. So biography aside, this is the cool part. Because usually when we introduce distinguished lecturers, they have 28,000 citations and all these cool papers, but other than the stuff they come and talk about it, their history's kind of dull. Ed's history is anything but dull. His internet fingerprints are very close to my own cybersecurity heart. So I talk about some of his more famous work. In 2000, he reinforced something security people call the reverse engineering get out of jail free card. And basically he was working on something, basically watermarking for intellectual property, and ended up basically coming at odds with something called the Digital Millennia Copyright Act. He and the EFF took it to court, and to some large extent, those of you in the room like me that are security professionals, one of the reasons that we don't go to jail when we do security research on some piece of hardware and software is due to Ed, because basically that safe harbor exists in the Digital Millennia Copyright Act. I think his work there led to him to create a blog in 2002 called Freedom to Tinker. You can see his policy thoughts developing in that blog, and it's a non-trivial piece of work. Has almost 700 pages, 2,000 entries, since the summer of 2002, 1,300 of which are Ed. Ed mentioned this morning when we talked there was 1 million words. And the nerd that I am, I had to go count them. They were 970,000. And leaving out the links and some other things. And then I did a statistical analysis, and the most used non-simple English word other than freedom and tinker was security at 1,702 times. Now, a couple last things, and we'll get on with this. In 2005, Ed worked on the Sony rootkit, which was something that most of us, was the first time we learned that a major corporation could also be a major felon, because they were installing rootkits on all of their customers' computers. And then the very last, Ed's also was one of the earliest investigators on voting machine security, and in fact, one of his co-authors on that work recently testified at one of the Russian election meddling hearings in Congress. And then my all-time favorite hack that I talk to all of my students about is something called a Princeton cold boot attack. And basically, Ed and his students, they demonstrated that capacitor at the heart of all you electrical engineering students know what this means, that the capacitor at the heart of all dynamic RAM that the charge is stored on, if you cool that RAM down to a very low temperature, the charge doesn't fade away and you can read that memory. And so they demonstrated that you could take this laptop, turn it upside down, spray it with the liquid out of a cold air bottle, take the RAM out, and read the cryptographic keys that were left in your RAM memory. Super cool hack, because unlike most cybersecurity that just kind of straddles around operating systems and software, this goes from device physics all the way to cryptography. And one last bit of history is Ed testified in the Microsoft antitrust case in 2001. And his role was to prove to the court that Windows, at that time Windows 98, could be separated from the browser. Turns out that Microsoft wanted to control the industry by keeping the browser and the operating system tied together. And his team proved that. I find it interesting that his team basically predicted, now this is 2001, almost the state we're in today, where those who might be in this room carrying a Chromebook, the browser is the operating system. And more importantly, with the advent of JavaScript, the browser that you have on your machine pretty much carries your entire application space, and the operating system, whether it's Linux or OS X or whatever, is kind of becoming irrelevant. So Ed's had a very colorful past. I will not go deeply into the subject of his talk today, but it's on two topics that we all find increasingly interesting and important, the area of blockchain and cryptocurrencies. It's titled Towards Scalable, Sustainable Cryptocurrencies. So without further delay, let's all warmly welcome Dr. Felten at the University of Delaware.
I want to talk today about cryptocurrencies. Now, a lot of people go around and they talk about cryptocurrencies maybe in terms like this. It takes more than 3 weeks to make $1 million in cryptocurrencies, really, if you ever will at all. But nonetheless, cryptocurrencies have gotten a bit of notoriety because of things like this. Notoriety that's led, say, to John Oliver commenting on cryptocurrencies, basically as let's say having a very significant element of scamminess about them. Even some very reputable computer scientists have gone around giving talks like this. This is Nick Weaver from UC Berkeley, and you can tell by this is an invited talk at the Usenix Enigma conference this year. You can tell by the title of the talk, Cryptocurrency, Burn It with Fire, that he's not a pro, but the first sentence of his abstract really says what his view is. The entire cryptocurrency and blockchain space is effectively one big fraud. Okay, so that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. But I'm not going to accept Nick's argument that the entire space is one big fraud. Because although there is really a world historic level of hype and snake oil in this space, there's also something very interesting going on, something that should be interesting to us as engineers and as people who are interested in what's happening in the world. So this talk will be basically in two parts. First, I'm going to talk about what I think is really going on and what I think is really valuable and interesting as a researcher in the cryptocurrency space. And then the second half, I'm going to talk about a particular piece of research that my team did to try to improve the scalability and privacy of some aspects of cryptocurrency systems. But first, let me talk about what I think cryptocurrencies are good for. And there are several things. First of all, blockchains, the idea of recording a bunch of data, reporting that data publicly by building a public data structure to which you append new records in a tamper-evident way, meaning that if you go back and try to change the history later, that will be evident. That's an idea that and the algorithms for doing that, in the absence of any currency, that goes back to the 1990s, and it's very valuable for lots of different applications. Essentially applications for which transparency and the requirement that somebody announce what they're doing to the entire world and not try to change it afterward, where that's valuable. And that's pretty valuable in some cybersecurity applications and others. So blockchains are useful by themselves. We've known that since the 90s. That's not new, but it's important to not forget. Second is that cryptocurrencies let us use money and conditional payments. I'll talk in a minute about conditional payments, what they are and why they're valuable, as a tool when we are designing distributed protocols. That is, when you have a set of different entities or participants interacting across a network or interacting on a common platform and they don't fully trust each other, you want them to be able to interact fruitfully despite the lack of trust. And so we might be designing a protocol or rules for interaction between them. Conditional payments and the use of cryptocurrencies are valuable in a way that I'll describe in a minute. That in particular, certain kinds of blockchain-based protocols, cryptocurrency-based protocols, allow very efficient, enforceable commitments from someone that they will pay money if some event occurs or if some event doesn't occur. And that, in turn, is a capability to have a payment which is triggered by some event and to have that be fully automatic and verifiable in the same way that we might verify, say, the correctness of a computer program is valuable. And then finally, at the end, I'll talk about how so-called smart contracts are a powerful tool that let you realize some really valuable mechanism designs to design more sophisticated, more capable ways to structure the interactions among parties online. First, let me talk about conditional payments. So here's the basic idea that I want to be able to say to you in a way that is enforceable and self-executing a statement like this. If you produce a solution to some equation, f of x equals 0, before some time t, then you'll receive a coin. And if you don't produce that solution, then I'll get the coin back. That's a cryptographic conditional payment. And that equation can be anything. I can require you to disclose some knowledge that you know. For example, f of x might be, say, the hash of x minus some known value. And that would require you to disclose a hash pre-image of that value or something else. So this conditional payment is extremely valuable. And it's valuable for a few different purposes. One purpose is for binding payments together. For example, if Alice is going to pay Bob and Charlie is going to pay Diane, and Charlie wants to make it the case that he pays Diane if and only if Alice pays Bob, then you can do that. And the way you do that is both Alice and Charlie make conditional payments, conditioned on a solution to the same equation being presented. Now you tell Alice, secretly knows the solution to that equation. So if Alice announces the equation, the solution, in order for the first payment to happen, that announcement announces the solution to the second conditional payment, which Charlie will be able to pick up and trigger. So you can say this payment will happen if and only if that payment can happen by making them contingent on the same condition. And that allows you to bind these things together, even if they're payments that are happening in different places and between people who don't know each other. You can incentivize participation in protocols. When you're designing interactions online, often you might structure the interaction in a complex way, and you have a set of rules that says, well, first Alice does this, and then Charlie does that, and then Alice does the following, and then Bob or Alice decrypts something, and then Bob decrypts his thing, and then et cetera. You might have this set of structured rules which cause a particular good outcome, right? And so the rules that are written down on the page in, let's say, a research paper say, next, Alice is supposed to decrypt the result of decrypt message 3 and reveal the underlying plaintext. Now, that's all well and good to write in a paper, Alice must do X. But in the real world, what if Alice doesn't do that? Alice might realize that what's going on is some kind of interaction, and she's not going to be happy with the end results. But what if she just stops? Now, if we're writing a research paper, or if somebody's giving a lecture about this, at this point, they'll typically wave their hands furiously and say, well, we'll assume that there's some kind of outside mechanism by which we can punish Alice if she doesn't do this step, and I'm sure in practice it'll turn out that that can exist. But in practice, a lot of these sorts of solutions, these complicated distributed protocols, don't actually get used because there is not in practice a way to enforce someone's compliance with the rules. When they're supposed to do something, if they just don't do it, you don't have any recourse. And that's especially true in the internet, where you don't know who the other party is or where they are, and it's not like you can send the police to their house. So we can use conditional payments to incentivize their participation. At the beginning, Alice can make a deposit. She can put down a coin, which she can get back if and only if she actually does step 3 as required. So her recovering her own coin, which she deposited at the beginning, is conditional on her doing the required step. And now we have a story about how we can force people to do steps in protocols. And that opens us to actually use a whole bunch of things that were only feasible in theory before. And then finally, you can use conditional payments for things like outsourcing computation or storage. I want to hire you to compute some equation for me, to do some computation, or I want to hire you to store some data for me. I can make your payment, my payment to you for doing that for me, contingent on you actually doing a thing. So I pay you to store data for me, and you can get my payment and get back an additional coin that you deposited as a security, but only if you actually give me back my data later when I ask. Or I outsource to you, you promise to do a computation for me and give the right answer back. I can make my payment to you contingent on you providing some kind of certificate, that checkable certificate that you did the computation correctly. So all kinds of things which we previously would have had to either trust people about, or else, hey, there'll be some way to enforce it, but we're not saying how, we can now enforce. So conditional payments are actually pretty powerful, and they're a thing that you can do in full-featured cryptocurrency systems. You can make a payment conditional on somebody publishing a solution to really any equation like this, where f can be expressed as a computer program. So this is actually a really powerful mechanism in practice. Even more powerful than that, or a generalization of that, is something called smart contracts. So let me talk about smart contracts and how they work, what they are. Okay, so here we have two parties, Alice and Bob. And let's say that Alice and Bob are going to engage in an interaction. The interaction might be something like that Alice is going to buy a bicycle from Bob, right? And so the rules of this are that Alice's payment should go to Bob if and only if Bob delivers the bicycle. All right, so they can agree on they can come up with something like an escrow agreement. That is, they can agree that Alice will give her money to some trusted third party, and then that trusted third party will give the money on to Bob if Bob really delivered the bicycle, or if he didn't, then the trusted third party will give the money back to Alice. That protects both Alice and Bob if they trust the third party, but they don't want to find somebody they both trust. They want to have some kind of mechanism. So the way a smart contract works is something like this, that Alice and Bob agree that they're going to engage in some interaction, and they're going to agree on a set of rules that will govern that interaction. They express those rules in computer code, and you can think of this code as the instructions that an honest referee would follow in refereeing this interaction between Alice and Bob. Okay, so they take the rules of their interaction or the instructions to the referee, they write them down in code. And then you want to take that code and make a virtual machine. That is, you create a kind of virtual machine which is part of a cryptocurrency system. That is, the cryptocurrency system itself will enforce the correct execution of that virtual machine. That is, that it behaves according to the code. And that operates according to the code that's enforced by the cryptocurrency system, that virtual machine can hold money and dispense that money to Alice or to Bob or to anybody else. And it can send and receive data messages. So it can do anything that a person could do, but it behaves according to the rules that Alice and Bob agreed on. It acts as a referee for their interaction, and the cryptocurrency system itself enforces its behavior. So why is that useful? Well, one reason that's useful has to do with how people who work in the distributed systems field or the sort of internet protocols field talk about how interactions work. Often we design a distributed protocol by doing the following. First, we define an idealized version of the protocol, something that we can't really do, but which describes what it means for the protocol to be correct. We define an idealized version where the protocol is refereed by a notional, sort of hypothetical, trusted party who enforces the rules of the interaction fairly. Then we come up with some super complicated cryptographic message-based back and forth thing between Alice and Bob, which doesn't have a trusted third party. And then we prove by using advanced computer science theory magic that that interaction without a trusted third party is equivalent to the original idealized protocol. And that's really hard to do. It requires a lot of theory. We can make mistakes. And there's a lot of idealized functionalities that we can define, but we don't know how to design a protocol that does it. But with smart contracts, we don't have to design this sort of complex protocol without the trusted party. We can just describe the behavior of the notional imaginary trusted third party in code, and then we just make it a smart contract. And so any protocol for which we can define what correctness means in terms of a trusted referee, we can now implement. And that also allows us to implement types of distributed functionality and types of interactions at a distance between mutually untrusting parties that we didn't know how to do before. So this is a very powerful and general tool for building interaction rules between parties who don't necessarily trust each other. So that's kind of cool. Okay, but there's a bunch of open problems in the cryptocurrency space. So if we had a cryptocurrency system, and if that cryptocurrency system supported smart contracts and conditional payments, then we'd be really happy. There's a lot of things we can do that we couldn't do before, and it opens up a lot of opportunities for implementation and a lot for research, and a lot for business. Okay, but there's a bunch of open problems, and I'm going to talk a bit about some of these open problems in a minute. Actually, let me skip past this, and I'll talk about this in a minute. I want to dive now a little bit into Bitcoin, and sort of Bitcoin is the most popular, largest, and most valuable cryptocurrency that exists. It was also the first. And Bitcoin originated in this white paper, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system from 2008 that was published by a person or people who called themselves Satoshi Nakamoto. Nobody knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is or was, but nonetheless, this paper was published, and it was published along with an open source implementation of the software system that was described in this paper. Now, the problem that this paper solved, the problem that had not been solved before, went something like this. So suppose we wanted to have a currency that existed in fully electronic form. We're going to build a system that tracks ownership of the coins in that system. And so we're going to have something out in the cloud that keeps track of who owns which coins. And we're going to tell that cloud when I'm going to give a coin to you, and the cloud will debit my account and credit your account. So the cloud represents some notion of an agreement or a consensus about who owns which coins, and that consensus changes through transactions that participants in the system do. But you want to do that without having a central party who everyone has to trust. So the hard problem that Bitcoin tried to solve is how can you take thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of people all around the world who we don't know where they are, we don't know who they are, and get them to agree on who owns which coins? How can you get them to consensus about this? Now, an obvious thing about this is if you and I are anonymous to each other, and we're trying to agree on who owns which coins. I prefer a world where I have more coins. Your preferences will probably be different, right? So how can you get us to agree on who owns which coins when we have the most obvious possible motive to disagree and to try to yank the consensus in our own direction? Nobody really knew how to do this, how to have worldwide, large-scale consensus among people who don't know each other and whose identities are not even known, and how to do that in a way that's going to be reliable when there's real money at stake. But Bitcoin at least thought it had come up with the solution. The solution is something that's come to be called Nakamoto consensus. And I want to explain how it works because it's the key technical trick in Bitcoin, and it's kind of interesting in itself. So I want to do this in two stages. First of all, I'll talk about an impractical version of Nakamoto consensus that relies on one magical step, and then I'll tell you how to eliminate that magical step. Okay, so the magical step is, suppose we had a way to magically choose one participant in this worldwide system at random. And we could do that over and over. Each time we'd get a different person randomly, uniformly chosen from among all the participants. Can't really do that in practice, but let's ignore that for now. Okay, now here's what we could do. Every 10 minutes, we're going to pick a random participant, and we're going to ask them to publish a new block. And the new block will contain a set of transactions. Each transaction describes a payment from party A to party B. Okay? So, and there are very simple rules for what makes a transaction, a payment from Alice to Bob, valid. The transaction is valid if the person paying has digitally signed it to say that they authorize the transaction, if the number of coins that are transferred is not negative, and if the person making the payment actually has enough coins to make that payment. If that's true, then the transaction is valid. Okay, so we're going to pick that random person. We're going to say, bundle together a list of valid transactions that you know of that haven't yet been published, put them together, call it a block, and then publish that block. Okay, and we tell everyone else, what we'd like you to do, please, we can't enforce it, but please, ignore that block as invalid if it contains invalid transactions, or if its internal pointer to the previous block is invalid. And then we let the person who make the block include in that block a magic transaction in which they give themselves some new coins which are newly created, called the block reward. So that's what we're going to do. So let's think about the dynamics of this. Suppose we have a chain of blocks, and there are 3 blocks which so far contain only valid transactions. And now the random magic finger falls on Mallory, and Mallory is told to please make a new block, and Mallory makes a block that contains at least one invalid transaction. Okay, now you're picked next to make the next block. Now the rules say that you should please ignore that block because it's invalid. But there's no enforcement for those rules. There's no police that's going to come to your house, or nobody's going to kick you out of the system if you don't. You can make whatever block you want. You could make a block like that. You put valid transactions in your block, you point to this one as invalid. The rules say that your block is supposed to be treated as invalid, but you went ahead and made it anyway because you're a rebel. Okay, but now other people get chosen. Let's say somebody else gets chosen. They choose to follow the rules and make this block. They ignore this block because it has an invalid transaction. They ignore your block because it points to a previous block that's invalid. And so they say, well, this is the latest transaction. The rules say I'm supposed to extend that latest block. And more people do that, right? So if most people are following the rules, but you're not, this is what's going to happen. This chain will get long. And everyone will, or almost everyone, will see this as a valid chain. So let's think through the implications of this. So you got a block reward. That's real money that you got. Your block reward is recorded in the block you made, which is up here. If your block is ignored, then your block reward is ignored. And if everyone ignores the fact that you have $100, then you really don't have $100 at all. Right? So if your block is ignored, your block reward is ignored. Your incentive is to make a block that's not ignored. Right? Because you want that sweet block reward, and you want it to be recognized by everybody. So therefore, if it's the case that almost everyone else ignores rule-violating blocks, then what you ought to do, if you're greedy and at all clever, is to is to follow the rules and to ignore invalid blocks and to be like these people, right? And so this is an argument, and therefore, universal rule following, where everyone follows the rules, is an equilibrium, in the sense that if everyone else is doing it, then you should do it too. And if everyone is doing it, then the first person to deviate from this, in fact, the first several people to deviate from it, are just costing themselves money. So this is the argument that even though there's no enforcement, and this is just phrased as a please, that once you get into a mode where people are following these rules, then it will be stable, and that it'll be an equilibrium, and rule following will occur, and therefore, that you will get worldwide consensus on who owns which coins. Despite the greed of this person making them put in an invalid transaction in which they got $1 million, bazillion, trillion dollars, that got ignored, and the rules were followed. Okay. So, if we had this magical operation to randomly pick a member of the system, that would be great, we could win. But we don't have that. So the problem is we don't have a list of participants, we can't make a list. If we tried to make a list, one participant could put on funny disguises and hats and pretend to be a lot of different people. On the internet, nobody knows that you're not a dog, nobody knows you're not 100 people. You could pretend to be a lot of different people. And so you can't really pick a random participant in practice. So the way you do this, in fact, is you choose at random, but you choose in proportion to the amount of computing power that somebody has. That people have a contest in which they demonstrate that they have and are using computing power, and you pick in proportion to how much computing power you're consuming, because you can't fake that. So you can't fake having more computing power than you really have. So you pick a computational problem that has very few solutions and requires a brute force blind search to find the solution. That is, the best known algorithm for finding the solution is to guess the answer and then keep checking different guesses until you find one that works. Now, if I'm checking trial answers twice as fast as you, then my odds of finding the real solution before you are twice as high, right? And so if you find a solution to this problem, you get to make a block, and the block reward is your incentive to try. So this is a way of picking participants at random, not in proportion to how many people there are, but in proportion to computing power, and that is feasible. This is what in Bitcoin is called mining. And this is the distinctive feature of the system and the very clever mechanism that Satoshi, whoever he, she, or they is or are, came up with. Now, let's talk a little bit about this. The block reward, the difficulty of this mining problem self-adjusts so that one solution is found every 10 minutes on average. So the more people come in if more people come in with faster devices, the problems will get harder. So it's still one problem per 10 minutes. Initially, the block reward, how much you get from making a block, was 50 bitcoins. It cuts in half every 4 years. It's currently 12.5 bitcoins. That's about $47,500 per block every 10 minutes, given out to whoever is the lucky person who solves a particular computational problem. And these block rewards increase the number of bitcoins in solution in existence. That's how new coins get made. So what are the implications of this? Well, the block reward adds up to about $7 million a day of new coins that are given out to miners. And economics predicts, therefore, that the mining community will expend about $7 million worth of resources per day on buying equipment for mining and burning electricity for mining. Mining is therefore highly professionalized. It's a contest with a prize of $7 million a day. No surprise, people work really hard to try to get a higher share of that. It's done by specialized parties with custom designed equipment. And it uses lots of energy. A big portion of that $7 million a day is spent on electricity. Estimates are that about 0.1% of all world energy use is consumed by Bitcoin mining. That is not a good thing. It would be better if we could do this without putting so much carbon into the atmosphere. Okay, so open problems related to Bitcoin. First of all, there's no proof that this Nakamoto consensus algorithm is incentive compatible. I carefully said before that universal rule following is an equilibrium. There are, in fact, other equilibria. And there's not a satisfactory theoretical account of why it is that the rule following equilibrium is the one that will continue to stick. Nakamoto consensus is hugely resource intensive. It burns a lot of energy, puts a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. That is effort and cost, resources that are wasted. That is, well, what it does is it keeps the Bitcoin system alive and consistent, which is of value, but nonetheless, it would be a lot better if we could get this worldwide consensus without burning so many resources. Other consensus algorithms have been proposed that have other desirable properties. They might be more resource efficient and so on, but we don't know how good they are. And the systems can scale to many participants, but not to a lot of transactions per second. The global Bitcoin system can do maybe at best a dozen, 2 dozen transactions a second, something like that, globally. And that is interesting that you can do any transactions in a worldwide decentralized system. But obviously, you're not going to be replacing the world banking system with this. So, and not to mention all the financial, social, and cultural challenges. So lots of open questions here. I think this is a really interesting area for research. To give you an example of the kind of research, I want to switch to the second mini talk, which is discussing a particular bit of work in this space that came out of my lab at Princeton. And this is a paper called Arbitrum Scalable Private Smart Contracts from Unix Security 2018. So this was presented last summer at the Unix Security Conference with my co-authors Harry Kolodner, Stephen Goldfeder, Xiaoqi Chen, and Matt Weinberg. And one note here is if you have read our paper, in the unlikely event that you've read our paper, or the maybe also unlikely event that you read it afterward, that the terminology I'm going to use in this talk is a little different than the terminology used in the paper. I'm using the terminology that doesn't confuse people in talks, we've learned, as opposed to the terminology in the paper that's a little bit more confusing, and apologies for that. Okay. So let me start by talking about something which I left out of the first part of the talk because I was going to come back to it now, and that is this notion of smart contracts, and talk a little bit in more detail about how that's implemented. The leading cryptocurrency system that implements this smart contract functionality is called Ethereum. Ethereum is the second biggest cryptocurrency. And the way that, and if you recall, what a smart contract is it's specified by some computer code which describes the behavior of a trusted third party. And the cryptocurrency miners, or the consensus system, is supposed to simulate or enforce the correct behavior of that virtual machine according to its code. And the way this works in Ethereum is that every miner in Ethereum emulates every execution step of every contract. So imagine that the code of a contract is compiled down to some machine code that describes what will happen in some virtual machine. Every miner has to laboriously walk through every single machine code instruction that every contract executes. And because that's expensive for the miners, people who want to have their contracts executed are charged for the privilege, and they have to pay what in Ethereum is called gas for the computation that their contract does, and also for the storage that it uses, because the storage, memory, and files that a particular contract uses have to be also held, maintained by the miners. And the contract complexity, the amount of stuff you can do, is capped by what's called the global gas limit. And this is imposed by the fact that miners are regular computers, and there's only a certain amount of storage and only a certain amount of emulation of computation that an ordinary computer that is a miner can do. And so if we were to ask an individual miner to do more emulation than a reasonable computer can do, then the system would break down. And so that the capacity of each individual miner to do this emulation puts a global limit on the amount of resources that you can use. That's called the global gas limit, and it's relatively low. The global gas limit for Ethereum is something like 1/10 the computing power of a low-end laptop. So very low, and that's a global total limit. And in Ethereum, all of the code and data of these contracts is public. So the total throughput of the system globally is limited to the number of steps that a single miner can emulate within one block time. And I talked about how in Bitcoin, a block is every 10 minutes. In Ethereum, it's every 15 seconds. Okay, so the question is, can we scale smart contracts? And if you've been to any research talks, you know that if the presenter asks a question like this, the answer is going to be yes. And in fact, the answer we think is yes. To explain how we do it in our system, I want to talk about sort of 3 layers of implementation in a smart contract system. There's the consensus layer. That's the part that I talked about with Bitcoin, where you have this worldwide system for agreeing on which transactions are deemed to have happened and which not. On top of that, you have the smart contract layer, which is a layer that is able to, in which miners figure out what it is that smart contracts will do and keep track of the state and computation of the smart contracts using the underlying consensus system to agree on those things. And then on top of that, you have an application, distributed application, or DApp in the lingo, which is like an application, like a smart contract that's written to implement some application. So we're talking about how to scale this smart contract layer. There are scalability issues at this first level consensus layer. That's a really important area for research, but not what I'm talking about today. Okay, so how do you scale these smart contracts? There's alternative approaches that people have used, and I want to run through a couple of them first. The first one is Snarks, or in general, the notion of using some kind of probabilistically checkable zero-knowledge proof to have a very compact and efficiently checkable zero-knowledge proof of correct execution for a smart contract instead of and then the idea is the miners would just check that instead of having to painstakingly emulate every step. Problem is that conventional Snark systems require a trusted setup step, which in the straightforward implementation requires a separate trusted setup for every contract, and having a mutually trusted party is a thing you were trying to avoid. You use smart contracts because you didn't have that. So that's in practice a problem. And also that constructing these proofs of correct execution can be very expensive. Another approach is something called incentivized verification that's used by systems like TrueBit. The idea is that somebody announces a claim as to what a smart contract would do, and then you invite everyone to check it. And you say, if you check this claim and it turns out to be wrong, we'll give you a bounty. And anyone can volunteer to show up and collect that bounty. And you have to structure that carefully so just the right number of people show up. So long story short, well, this doesn't provide privacy. And also there's some serious incentive compatibility problems. In our paper, we prove a theorem that basically within a broad family of protocols, which includes the TrueBit protocol, there is no protocol that has the desired property. Basically, that there's an attack in which I can announce the result of a computation and then pretend to be 4 different people who show up to check that computation, and that will work within any system that is structured in the way that TrueBit is. So this turns out not to be sound, we think. And there's also so-called state channel methods, and I don't want to go too much into that, but it makes assumptions about unanimity and a lack of bad behavior that we think are unrealistic. Okay, so we have a different approach, which we call Arbitrum, that I'm going to talk about, which tries to make smart contracts scalable by using a combination of several things. Of protocol design, that is how it is that the different miners and participants interact with each other. Incentives, where we use conditional payments to give people money if they behave in certain ways, so that certain kinds of behavior that is less efficient for the system overall is strongly disincentivized. And also virtual machine architecture. It turns out that if you define your smart contract to execute on some virtual machine architecture, that it matters a lot how that architecture is designed. And we have some clever tricks in how we design our architecture that will make this more efficient. I'll explain that in a minute. So let me talk about how this works. One of the important components is something that we sometimes call the validator or the bridge. And this is something which basically is an interface layer between our Arbitrum smart contract layer and an underlying consensus layer. So bottom line here is we assume there's some underlying consensus system which can reach consensus about which transactions have happened. There are many approaches to underlying consensus. You could do it Bitcoin style. You could have just a central authority who just decides and decrees. And there's various sorts of trickier distributed system theory tricks like Byzantine fault-tolerant agreement protocols and so on. We're agnostic as to what you do at consensus layer. We're going to assume that there is a distributed consensus layer. If you prefer to think about it as being the Bitcoin mining protocol I described before, that's fine. One of the important things, though, in our system is the notion of validators. So when you make a virtual machine, one of these virtual machines that will act as the referee or trusted third party in an interaction, you give a list of validators for it, parties who you want to be the validators for your virtual machine. And the validators are supposed to keep track of a virtual machine's computation and data. And the guarantee that we give you is what we call the any trust guarantee. That is, if at least one validator of a virtual machine is honest, then the virtual machine will execute correctly according to its code. And this is actually an unusual kind of guarantee to give in a distributed system setting. Usually, the guarantees that you get are something like you have to assume a majority are honest, because you might have a majority vote about what happens. But we can give you this guarantee that if at least one validator is honest, you'll get a correct result. And that actually makes it much more practical to find a set of validators. Because if you and I are engaged in some interaction, then if you and I are the validators, then we each can be confident that there is someone to protect our own interests. There's someone to protect my interests, namely me, who's acting as a validator. Okay, so here's an example, a two-player game with Alice and Bob playing, let's say, a game of chess for either a coin or some kind of gold star. So the idea is, if they're playing chess, you'd write a piece of code which knows the rules of chess, which holds the gold star, which will be the prize, which receives in alternating fashion from Alice and Bob messages saying what the next move is, validates the move, makes the move, determines if the game is over, and when the game is over, pays out the coin as needed. Right? So that's what this code does. Alice and Bob can write this code, they can inject it into Arbitrum, they can name themselves as the two validators, and then they'll both know that Alice knows that if she actually outplays Bob in chess, that she will get the gold star. Okay, so now how do validators cooperate to advance the state of a virtual machine? The first thing to say is that validators have incentives to agree unanimously about what a virtual machine will do. The validators have to pay some fees for what they do, and those fees are lower, much lower if they agree unanimously. So if they agree unanimously on what is the next thing a VM will do, they can just jointly digitally sign that and submit it. And if they all agree on what's going to happen, the system accepts that assertion. And that is consistent with this any trust guarantee, because if all validators say that something has happened and at least one validator is honest, then the honest validator has asserted that, they have agreed, and so the system is allowed to just let it happen. So that's really easy. A unanimous assertion looks like this. The system in the beginning, the miners, if you will, know the hash of the machine state. They know the hash of the message inbox that the VM has. That's what's called the preconditions. And the assertion says, with these preconditions, the virtual machine can execute n steps of computation. The result is that the hash of its state is now this, the hash of its mailbox is now this, and along the way it took these actions, paid out these coins to these parties, and sent those messages. That's a unanimous assertion. If all the validators agree, we're good. So put the validator's signature on it, the system will just accept it. It just checks that the signature is valid and that these preconditions actually describe the current state of the VM. And also that the VM actually has the coins that this purports to spend. If those three things are true, very easy for the miners to check, then the state of the VM has advanced very easily. So that's just confirmed. Okay, but what if the validators don't agree? This is the interesting case, right? The easy case is where everyone agrees. If they don't agree, then we use a system called disputable assertions. So any validator can make an assertion. When you make an assertion, a disputable assertion, this is a claim about what a VM will do. You have to put down a deposit, some funds, which you are at risk of losing if your assertion turns out to be a lie. The assertion is subject to challenge for some window of time. If somebody challenges it, says, no, that's not right, then they put down a deposit as well. And then, if there's a challenge, a party that is wrong, somebody who's lying, is going to lose their deposit. And that's your incentive to not lie, and it's your incentive to not issue a bad challenge. So how does this work? Well, here's a disputable assertion. Somebody puts down an assertion, a claim that says that here's the precondition, here's, say, the initial hash of the virtual machine state. After n steps of computation, the hash of its state is this, and it takes these actions. This assertion is marked as pending by the miners, and a clock starts. If the clock runs out and nobody issues a challenge, then the miners will accept this. The fact that nobody was willing to put it, no other validators was willing to put any of their own money on the line in order to try to take the deposit of this person because they were lying, is taken as evidence that they weren't lying. and the system will accept it. The alternative is if somebody does put down a challenge, now the miners need to referee this dispute. And here's how that happens. It happens via a bisection protocol. So imagine that someone has made this assertion and somebody else has challenged it. Now, the asserter is now responsible for bisecting. So here's the challenge. They're responsible for bisecting their assertion, breaking it into two half-size pieces by saying what is the hash of the state in the middle and how are these actions broken up between the first half and the second half. So if this initial claim assertion was wrong, then at least one of these two has to be wrong. And so the onus is now on the challenger to say, I'm challenging this half or I'm challenging that half. Notice that the miners only need to validate that this is a valid way of breaking this assertion in half, that these two halves are both half length, that the end of this half-size assertion is the precondition for this one, and that these two sets of actions compose together to make that one. Very easy for them to check. Now the challenger has to choose one half to dispute. Let's say they dispute that half. Now you do it again recursively. Again, there's a bisection by the asserter. The challenger picks another half and challenges that. And after a logarithmic number of rounds of this, you get down to a situation where the asserter is making an assertion about one step of execution of the virtual machine. And that some one-step assertion will be challenged, right? So either this happens and you go through these steps, or one of the players backs out and that player loses. Now what you've done is, in a relatively simple set of steps, which, by the way, these players are paying the miners to do with mining fees, you have narrowed down the dispute into a dispute about one step of execution. All right. The next step is a one-step proof. A one-step proof, now the asserter has to provide a proof, which the miners can check, that says if the hash of the state of the virtual machine is this, and it can execute one instruction, and after executing that instruction, the hash of the state will be this. So now you might ask, how big is this one-step proof, and how costly is it to create and verify? We'd like it to be really small and really cheap and to make and verify. Okay, so this is where we move to the final part of our design, which is how we design our virtual machine architecture. By designing the virtual machine architecture using some tricks I'll describe in a minute, we can guarantee that all instructions in the virtual machine can be emulated in small constant time, and the one-step proofs are of small constant size, by which I mean a few hundred bytes, and they can be created and verified in small constant time, by which I mean a few milliseconds. It might not be immediately obvious how this can be the case. How you can have a virtual machine with a very big state, a large program and a large memory, and can execute it in such a way that any proof of single step of execution can be verified, can be written and verified in constant time. But it turns out you can, and without using a lot of really fancy cryptography. The way we do this is by designing the virtual machine so that these things are true. 4 principles. First of all, the entire state of the virtual machine is expressed as a tree, and it's what cryptographers call a Merkle tree. What that means is that you can compute the hash of each node of the tree, cryptographic hash, and that the hash of a node that is internal to the tree, you compute just by concatenating the hashes of its children and hashing those together. So it's a tree, and you can compute cryptographic hashes stepwise from bottom to top. That's a Merkle tree. The entire state of the VM is expressed that way. The tree is of limited degree, limited fan-out, no more than a fan-out of 8 at any level. Every leaf of the tree is of limited size, no more than 32 bytes. And here's the hard one, that instructions that execute on this virtual machine only affect items that are near the root of the tree, only in the top 3 levels of the tree. And because of that, it turns out that the proofs can be small. That if you have this sort of tree that represents the state of the virtual machine, that in order to do a one-step proof, you have to sort of reveal the top levels of the tree, just enough of the top of the tree to allow the verifier, the miners, to know what they need to know to execute this instruction. Oh, it's an add instruction, and this is what the arguments are, and so on. Okay, so let me talk about why this is hard in a conventional architecture. So in a conventional virtual machine architecture, if you just design your virtual machine architecture in sort of the natural way, you would be tempted to represent memory as a big flat array of cells, right? And if you want to be able to have a concise cryptographic hash which summarizes the state of memory, you'd probably build a Merkle tree like this. That is, you have cells of memory, and you have, I'll make it a binary tree here, that like this node contains the hash of these two nodes, this node contains the hash of the hashes stored here, and so on. So now this node, the cryptographic hash of this, is a summary or commitment to the value of the whole tree. Now, if you want to prove that this cell contains a 5, you would have to reveal that this cell containing a 5 is consistent with a root hash which the verifier already knows. You would have to reveal the stuff that is marked in gray here. That if you reveal the gray stuff here, that revealing these two things says that this is a 5 and allows the verifier to compute the hash of this. Now they know the hash of this. You've given them that. They can compute the hash of this. Now they know the hash of this. You've given them the hash of that. You can compute the hash of this and compare it to what you knew already. So this is a logarithmic size proof containing, in this case, 4 things in a tree of depth 4, as it turns out, and allows the check to be done. If this memory were larger, of size n, it would take log n steps, a log n size of this proof. So that's a logarithmic size, not constant size. Now, in terms of the code for your program, you have a similar thing, right? The natural thing would be to represent the code as a linear array of instructions, and then you have a program counter, which is an index into that. And similarly, to prove that the current program counter points to a read instruction, you would need to someone who already knows the program counter and already knows the hash of the root, you'd need to do a similar sort of Merkle tree hash thing, again, logarithmic. So how do we do those things in constant time and space? So here's the trick. We change that memory architecture as follows. Instead of a large flat memory, we represent the memory in our virtual machine as a set of fixed size blocks, which we call tuples, that have up to 8 items. And a tuple, a slot in a tuple can contain either a regular integer value or something like that, or it can contain another tuple, a reference to another tuple. So you can have a tree of tuples that represent the state of your program, containing as much data as you want. Now, instead of the emulator, the virtual machine emulator, maintaining that tree and generating the proofs like this, instead, application-level code manages the tree. If you want to read something that's down the tree, you have to explicitly execute instructions to walk down that tree step by step. So app-level code manages the tree. Instead of having a memory read instruction, which is one instruction, instead you make a call to a library function, which actually walks the tree for you. So as a programmer, instead of writing memory read instruction, you write call memory read, same thing. It's just as easy for you, but it executes as a library call. But now here's the important part. In a conventional architecture, you would execute one instruction, but it would take a logarithmic number of operations to emulate that instruction. But if you walk the tree, if you walk down the tree one step at a time, then it takes a logarithmic number of instructions to walk from the root down to the leaf, but each instruction has constant cost because it's only one step. So although it's more instructions, the total cost to emulate it is of the same order. But then crucially, whereas before it required logarithmic time and space to do proof and verification, if you walk one step at a time, then it requires constant time proof and verification. So that's how we handle memory. Instructions we handle in an even trickier way. Rather than storing the code logically in a list in a conventional architecture, we instead store it in a stack, which is a pretty weird sounding thing to do. Rather than advancing the program counter, you pop the stack to get the next instruction. That is constant time. Instead of a jump instruction, which just sets the program counter to something, instead you just replace that instruction stack. You push in a new instruction stack. You just replace the instruction stack with a new value. Instead of calling a function where you push the program counter onto a call stack and then change the program counter, you instead push the old instruction stack onto a call stack and you can restore it later. Now that actually, all of these are constant time operations and they let you do something that's equivalent to traditional code. So by weird virtual machine architecture tricks, we can make all operations constant time. So here's the Arbitrum virtual machine architecture. There's an instruction stack, a data stack, a call stack, and some other values. Here's what a one-step proof would actually look like. So assuming that we start with the root of the virtual machine state in a particular hash, suppose that the instruction that we want to prove is an add instruction. We would need to expand out just this. The state root is its hash is determined by hashing these 5 things, so we need to provide the hashes of these 5 things. The register, static, and call stack, those are not used by this instruction, so for those, all we need to do is reveal their top-level hash. For the instruction stack, we need to reveal the top layer, unpack that this is an add and that this is something else whose hash we announce. Doesn't matter because that doesn't affect how this instruction executes. On the data stack, we'd have to unpack down 2 levels, reveal this 5 as the top level, the 3 is the next level, and then the hash of the rest. And if I tell you all of this stuff, now you know enough, you can verify the consistency that if you hash these things back together tree-wise up to the root, that it matches the state hash you knew before. And you now know that it's an add instruction, that you're adding 5 and 3, and that the result should be that on top of the stack there's now an 8, followed by this whatever it is. And that allows you to compute to rehash what the state of this thing will be after this instruction, and you can verify that it is what it was supposed to be. Okay, so this is a relatively concise way. This thing would be a few hundred bytes in practice. So this is how we get very concise one-step proofs. So bottom line, most of the time in the system you'll get unanimous verification, but when you don't, we have this very efficient way of resolving disputes by first narrowing the dispute to 1 step and then very efficiently executing 1 step. So let's talk about privacy. This is relatively straightforward. The state of a VM is revealed only to its validators. You've already decided that you trust the validators. All that appears on the main hash chain visible to the public is cryptographic hashes of the virtual machine state. You can salt those if you want so that they don't reveal anything. The number and timing of the steps executed by the virtual machine, and then any payments that it makes and receives. We built an academic prototype of this, which is described in our paper. We built all the pieces, an assembler, a loader, a runtime, an honest validator that executes correctly, and a standard library that does most of the things you'd want. From this, we've built a commercial version which interoperates with Ethereum and is designed to be fully interoperable with Ethereum in order to make it easy for people to switch. So let me talk about the performance benefits you can get from this approach. This is one admittedly sort of unfair benchmark, but it gives you an advantage of what the performance upside looks like. This is a contract which does iterated hashing, that it just computes SHA-2 hashes over and over and over. So one virtual machine on Arbitrum on a typical graduate student laptop can do about 970,000 SHA-2 hashes per second running on the real software system. A native machine, by comparison, does about 1.7 million per second. So you can run about half the speed of a native machine within a single VM. Ethereum supports 10,000 hashes per second globally. But importantly, this is per virtual machine. This is global total. So it's not just the factor of about 100 faster for this application. It's a factor of 100 faster times the number of virtual machines that you're running. Okay, so this provides scalable private smart contracts, and it does that by this combination of different features. This is an example of what smart contracts can do for you. Okay, let me finally just close by talking about what I think the prospects for the cryptocurrency space might be. The space is currently undergoing a kind of shakeout. There are fewer get-rich-quick schemes going on. There is a more prevalence of more careful and patient approaches to figuring out how to solve problems. What are the problems that users and the market have, and what can we do that will be sound and sustainable to addressing it? There's a ton of interesting computer science and computer engineering research questions that are open in this space around the stability of these protocols, around how to execute these things, around ways of using cryptography to make things more efficient. There's no end of research problems in this space. And the underlying usefulness of this technology, the ability to do payments, to do cryptographically conditional payments, smart contracts as a way of implementing distributed worldwide functionality, that's all still there. And I would expect it to be realized more and more over time. We're in the early stages of a transition of this from a hype-based technology to one that actually provides value, which is less than today's hype, but which is more than the fears of those who think it's all a scam. All right. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you. Anyone?
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Oh,
Anybody have any questions for Dr. Felten?
I like it.
Yeah. So my question is, with this system, similar to how anyone can kind of just start running mining programs on their computers, do they download this VM and run it
Yeah.
as a standalone, or would it run inside of like a virtual box or workstation environment?
Yeah, there's different ways of doing it. The virtual machine is kind of notional, and when you create a VM in the system, you have a set of validators, and the validators have to actually have software that has a VM emulator inside of it. And so probably in the common case, you would, if you're a validator, you would download open source validator software, which would then do that for you. Because the validator protocol is public, and because the VM architecture is public and all the software is open source, you can write your own if you want. But yeah, but fundamentally, if you're a validator, you need to download. If you're just a user of the system, then you don't need to download anything special. Just like any Ethereum contract, if you're just a user of it, then you can just interact with it via your browser.
Got to see the audio.
All right. Okay, got it.
I enjoyed the talk, Ed. What do you see as the future of cryptocurrency? What's it going to be like in 5 years or 10 years?
I think you'll see several things happening. One thing is, I think there'll be some maturing of cryptocurrencies as a payment technology, as a way of channeling payments. One of the challenges that exists in the space now is that although the popular cryptocurrencies trade against the dollar and other currencies on open markets, their dollar price fluctuates a lot. And there have been efforts to create systems, so-called stable coins, which are, whose relationship to, let's say, the dollar is much more stable over time. And so I think you may see you may see a big reduction in the volatility of the currencies as currencies. I also think you're going to see a big growth in the development and application of ordinary consumer apps via the smart contract vehicles. Once it becomes feasible to execute complex computations efficiently as smart contracts, there are a bunch of reasons why certain kinds of commercially significant applications would move in that direction. So you're going to start to see this becoming a platform for application development that will allow some interesting things to happen. I'd say those are probably the big trends. There was somebody way over here.
Your presentation was very interesting, and I'm glad I didn't completely glaze over because I thought I might. I had 3 quick questions. One, it seems to me I don't know anything about cryptocurrencies except what I've just learned today, but it seems like there might be a vulnerability in the way if you were to manipulate the assertion deposit. My second question is, can you speak to the way, a normal contract is a couple of lawyers, they write a contract, and lawyers are highly governed. So can you speak to international law, federal law, and say Jersey law, Delaware law? How are we regulating this?
Sure. Let's see. So the first one about manipulation of the assertion deposit, I think that's maybe a longer conversation. In our paper, we try to describe carefully the sort of details of this protocol, which are designed to prevent the bad scenarios that might otherwise arise. And maybe we could have a longer conversation offline about what particular sort of manipulation you have in mind and why, I hope. we have a defense against it or we're secure against it. We did think very carefully about the ways in which someone could try to someone could try to exhaust someone else's funds so they'd be unable to issue a challenge and other sorts of scenarios like that. And the protocol is designed with care to make it so that those sorts of things are not likely to work. But we could have a more detailed conversation about that. With respect to contracts and law, really I think the best answer to that is that these so-called smart contracts are not really contracts in the legal sense at all. It's an unfortunate term, smart contract, because it would lead you to think that it's like a legal agreement, but it's not. Right? What it is a mechanism. It's a mechanism that a group of parties agree on what its functionality will be because they agree on the code, or at least, and then that mechanism is turned on and it operates. So unlike a legal contract, which has very different rules in terms of how it's interpreted, if there is a bug in a legal contract, if you and I make an agreement about something and we write down a contract and there's like a typo in the language, we forgot to put the word not in, but we both knew what we meant, and interpreting that contract without the word not would be like weird and unnatural, then the legal system will fix that for us. Right? Some judge will say, clearly they meant to say not here, and we'll be okay, right? So there's this sort of interpretation. A legal contract can be incompletely theorized, that is, it doesn't need to cover every corner case. The legal system will fill things in and so on in a reasonable way. This is code. It is a mechanism, you turn it on, it goes. And that's a very different thing. And it has pros and cons compared to a legal contract. The fact that it's a mechanism and it's sort of self-executing means it will do what it was supposed to do, and somebody can't hire an expensive lawyer to make it not happen. And it doesn't cost a lot to resolve disputes and so on. But the drawback is if there's a bug in your quote-unquote smart contract code, it will do what it was programmed to do. And although there is a limited amount of recourse, for example, in Arbitrum, if all of the validators agree, they can change the code. But unanimously, that's a side effect of the design. A smart contract is a very different vehicle, and it operates independent of whatever law might exist. There's a question over here.
Okay, so I have a question about sort of on the line of the interface between cryptocurrency and the real world.
Yeah.
So so far we see cryptocurrency has been more on the technology aspect that make the currency work like being a credible medium of transactions.
Yeah.
So there are other economic concepts that we rely on every day, such as interest rate, such as credit.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a very convincing, how should I say, notation or conceptualization, how to make those concepts build into a cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
So my question is along the line that do you see that those concepts that you can build those concepts for cryptocurrency by just a patch the definition of cryptocurrency, or you need a more fundamental redesign of the cryptocurrency scene?
There are relationships and institutions of a sort in the cryptocurrency space that do things like make loans and charge interest and so on, charge interest, pay interest. Those things can all exist in this space. And there's nothing inherent about dollars that enables things like credit and so on, right? Those are capabilities that are built, if you will, on top of the dollar infrastructure through other kinds of relationships. So there's no fundamental reason why you couldn't take out a mortgage that's denominated in bitcoins, for example. There's no fundamental reason. The reason in practice you don't is because of the price fluctuations. But if you have a cryptocurrency whose value is reliably scaled against the dollar, for example, then you easily could do that. In fact, you could have cryptocurrencies that really are dollars. It's not out of the question, for example, that the Fed could issue a cryptographic version of the dollar, which was you would give them $1 and they'd give you one of these crypto dollars, and then you could trade it around and it could be redeemed to get back a real dollar. and because it's the Fed, you know that they're good for you. There's no fundamental reason why that can't or shouldn't happen. It's mostly just that right now, people who are attuned to financial risk would prefer not to have debts or liabilities or assets that are denominated in cryptocurrency because of price fluctuation. I think that's a problem that will solve itself if the prices stabilize.